Hello, everybody. Welcome to the seventh session of Cha Time with Sicha. My name is Jack Lee, and I am the president of the Singapore Heritage Society, which is one of the founding members of Sicha. So what I'm just going to do today is tell you a little bit about Sicha and introduce our moderator for today. So Sicha is a regional organization. Our mission is to promote effective partnership between governments and communities in cultural heritage management. And the aim is to strengthen the ASEAN socio-cultural community as a people-centered third pillar of ASEAN, to serve as a networking forum between ASEAN member organizations, and also as an entity that's associated with ASEAN governments and the ASEAN Secretariat. And some of the things that we do are to be a forum for robust discussion about heritage among ASEAN heritage professional practitioners, civil society, and community organizations, as well as interested members of the general public like you and me. And we want to promote public awareness of the importance of heritage protection as a vital component of sustainable national and regional development. We also aim to be a think tank and a resource center that supports ASEAN's policy and decision makers in heritage. And this is done through analysis, consultation, training, organizing seminars and conferences, and highlighting to governments and the public key issues of heritage, acting as a responsible third force, indigenous to ASEAN, but independent of the governments and of commercial stakeholders. So we just want to be a bridge between these heritage interests and the goals of people, business, and the government. And we also try to be a responsible, locally based advocate to promote development of heritage management programs in ASEAN, to place cultural heritage at the heart of the ASEAN community building efforts and creative solutions to protect heritage sites from damaging commercialization and urbanization. We also advocate to ASEAN ministers responsible for culture and arts and to senior officers that deal with culture and the arts, as set forth in the Vientiane Declaration. So essentially, we try to be a bridge between people and governments when it comes to talking about heritage. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our moderator for today. He is Mr. Mark Evidente. He's a lawyer and environmental partner in the Philippines. And he was most recently president of the Heritage Conservation Society in the Philippines, which is also a founding member of Sicha, and is now a member of the board of advisors. Mark is currently president and CEO of a company called 2Eco, and 2Eco is a sustainability consultancy firm which has successfully completed various tourism development projects, conservation plans, and policy studies in the Philippines. Mark holds a master's degree in environmental policy from Yale University, and he also has law and political science degrees from the University of the Philippines. So over to you, Mark, for you to introduce our speaker for today.
Okay, thank you for that, Jack. Thank you very much. So my role today is to first introduce our speaker for this afternoon, or morning or evening, wherever you're dialing in from, right? And to set the ground rules for the question and answer portion at the end of the talk. So first, let me talk about our speaker today, Ms. Dalilah Nabilah. Dalilah is pursuing a Ph.D. in geography at the University of Hawai'i in Mānoa. Her research focuses on understanding how disaster-affected communities memorialize an uncommon death caused by the unpredictable forces of nature, or commonly known as natural hazards. So while earning her bachelor's and master's degree in geography from the Universiti Brunei Darussalam, she studied interrelationships among national heritage, tourism practices, and local communities. She has come to appreciate how culture, politics, and the natural environment interact, and she hopes to continue analyzing and understanding the landscapes of the Asia-Pacific region. Now, that said, Dalilah's talk will last for about 30 to 45 minutes, And so I'd like to invite our participants in this event to please leave your questions in the question and answer box so that the speaker can respond to all of the questions after her talk. Okay, so we'll spend around 15 minutes at the end of the program for that. Okay, so I hope that's clear. And having said that, then I now turn over the floor to Dalilah. Take it away, Dalilah.
Aloha from Hawaii. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon from wherever you are. Let me begin by introducing myself again. I am Dalilah. I'm from Brunei Darussalam, born and raised. I'm a second-year Ph.D. student in the Department of Geography and Environment at University of Hawai'i in Mānoa. So before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Sicha and the organizer for having me to contribute to their 7th Chat Time series. So for the next half an hour or so, I'll be sharing with you about Kampong Ayer, its traditions, history, and how it fosters community resilience. Next slide. Great. So so I'll begin with a brief introduction of Brunei, followed by a historical account of Kampong Ayer, basically highlighting the changes that have occurred in Kampong Ayer over the decades. And before arriving to my conclusion that despite the changes in the physical landscape of Kampong Ayer, and the demographic composition of the area, the water or Brunei River itself is central in cultivating a sense of place among its residents, its former residents, and as well as Bruneians at large, and how the sense of place can foster a sense of resilience among the community there. Next slide, thank you. Okay. So Brunei Darussalam is located on the island of Borneo with an area of 5,765 square kilometers and a population of less than 500,000 as of 2020. Brunei is bordered by two East Malaysian states, Sabah and Sarawak, and we also have another neighbor, which is Kalimantan, Indonesia. And Brunei has 4 districts. There are Brunei Muara District, Tutong District, Belait District, and Temburong District. And this site I will be talking to all of you today, Kampong Ayer, is located in the Brunei Muara District within the municipal boundary of our capital city of Bandar Seri Begawan. Next. So before I start sharing with you about Kampong Ayer, I'd like to touch upon the different heritage sites in Brunei. Brunei Darussalam is endowed with a significant natural landscapes and cultural heritage. Since its independence in 1984, efforts have been made by the government to preserve sites and practices of historical and cultural significance. So many of the heritage sites in Brunei signify our national philosophy of Malay Islamic monarchy, or in Malay, we call it Melayu Islam Baraja. For short, we call it MIB, which is almost synonymous to Bruneian identity. So MIB in particular underlines the institutionalization of Islam as its official religion, the preservation of Malay, Malay as an identity, Malay as the nation's official language, and Malay as a form of cultural values, and the acceptance of the leadership of the monarchy, which is the Sultan. So, for example, Masjid Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin, so it is named after the 28th Sultan of Brunei, who initiated this construction. So the mosque serves as a symbol of the Islamic faith in Brunei. So the building was completed in 1958 and is an example of a modern Islamic architecture. So basically, most of the heritage sites in Brunei, well, as for the mosque, it explicitly signifies Islam as a religion, but there's also subtle representations in the cultural landscapes of Brunei, where, for example, Makam Raja Ayang. So the elements of MIB is represented or communicated through this different local designs in the architecture. And this has been consistent in many of the heritage sites in Brunei as well. Next. So the current legal framework of safeguarding cultural heritage in Brunei Darussalam is defined by the Antiquities and Treasure Trove Act of 2002. You go back to the previous slide. Right. So where this legal document regulates movable and immovable cultural heritage as well as natural heritage. So internationally, Brunei also ratified the UNESCO 1972 Convention concerning the protection of the world cultural and natural heritage. And in 2011, Brunei signed the UNESCO 2003 Convention for the safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage. So from here, we can see how Brunei is taking cultural heritage also seriously in their development projects. Next. So one of the main cultural landscape in Brunei that whenever I met tourists in Brunei or outside of Brunei, they would start talking about Kampong Ayer. So Brunei is almost synonymous to this area called Kampong Ayer, which is one of our main tourism attractions. Next. Before I begin, talking about the contemporary conditions of Kampong Ayer, I'd like to show how Kampong Ayer have also been developed and sustained through many centuries. And this is recalled in descriptions of the different travelers that arrived in Brunei. For example, Antonio Pigafetta in 1521, where he describes Kampong Ayer in particular. The city is entirely built in salt water, except the house of the king and certain chiefs. It contains 25,000 hearths. The houses are all constructed of wood and built up from the ground on tall pillars. So when the tide is high, women go in boats through the settlement selling articles necessary to maintain life. Next, there's another quote where another voyager also, I think his name is Francisco de Sande, he also describes Kampong Ayer and highlighting the different elements that the people at that time built their infrastructures. Where Francisco de Sande describes Kampong Ayer as, quote unquote, the city was very large and rich and was built over a very broad and deep river and had the appearance of another Venice. The buildings were made of wood, but the houses were excellently constructed, many of them being constructed of a stonework and gilded, especially the king's palaces, which were of huge size. So Kampong Ayer is also known as Venice of the East, and it comes from Francisco de Sande's description of it. And in the picture, you can see how a depiction of Kampong Ayer, which at that time was the capital of Brunei, in 1844, and you can see how the roofs are of Minangkabau style, and the different kind of housing structures are also depicted in this picture. And we can see how this depiction transitioned and changed over time to what Kampong Ayer is now today. Next slide. Kampong Ayer is also known as the former capital of Brunei. It's the old capital of Brunei from the 17th century until the 20th century. Some historians also argue that Kampong Ayer as the capital of Brunei existed as early as the reign of Sultan Muhammad Shah, which is our first sultan, who ruled from 1363 until 1402. In 1905, the first British resident, MacArthur, also proposed the idea of relocating the inhabitants of Kampong Ayer and the administrative offices to the mainland, because he notes that it's not feasible to have your administrative offices on water, so why not we move it on land? While he succeeded in relocating the capital, the inhabitants of Water Village or Kampong Ayer still decided, some of them still remain in the traditional dwellings. And this is a picture of Brunei Town in 1930s, so where you can see the red spot, that's where Kampong Ayer used to be, and I'd like to show in this presentation, I will show you how the landscape has shrunk and it expanded and it shrunk again. And I'll talk about it later as well. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so Kampong Ayer, when people are talking, even among Bruneians, some of the Bruneians think Kampong Ayer as a one village, when Kampong Ayer is a symbol or a label to multiple villages and multiple mukims who live within the area. So with Kampong Ayer, it consists of 6 village mukims, which is also known as administrative boundaries, which are Mukim Tamoy, Mukim Borong Pingay Ayer, Mukim Pramu, Mukim Saba, Mukim Sungay Kabon, and Mukim Sungay Kadayan. So each mukim, as you can see within the blue lines there, so each mukim is led by a penghulu or chief, and each mukim consists of several villages where each village is led by a ketua kampong. So over the years, the villages in the main Kampong Ayer, even today, it shrinks in size, and I will tell you why. Next. So naming in particular can draw attention to places and locate them in wider cultural narratives. And in the case of Kampong Ayer, this can be seen in the different names that we have in there. For example, some of the names are derived from its immediate natural environment, such as river tributary or local places. So for example, Kampong Pekanlama, so which can be translated as Old Town. So that area used to be a central market for the people of Kampong Ayer, where businesses are conducted in the area. So it became a small business center of a town, and in Malay language, Pekan means town, thus the name Pekan Lama. So another interesting name is Kampong Lorong Sikuna. So Kampong Lorong Sikuna, back in the days when Kampong Ayer served as a port, plenty of sailing ships called schooners often made their way across the river and settled in the area that is now known as Kampong Lorong Sikuna. So basically, lorong in Malay means lane and sikuna means schooner. So if we're going to literally translate it, it becomes schooner lane. So it's interesting to learn how these names reflect the cultural context and the historical context at that time. Some are also named after state dignitaries. For example, Kampong Sultan Lama, Kampong Penyarban Nahara Lama, Kampong Pemanca Lama, Kampong Setia Pahlawan. So most of these names are the names of our nobles. Some are inherited, some are born with the title. For example, Pangeran, some are endowed or bestowed by the Sultan. And others are also named after the craftsmen of the villages. For example, Kampong Pramu, which was named because its villagers used to meramu, gather wood to build houses. And Kampong Panday Besi was named because this village was once the residence of country's blacksmith. So back then, back in the 19th century or back in 20th century, Kampong Ayer was pretty much a cultural hearth of Brunei where we can find all the traditional crafts and practices in Kampong Ayer. So with these names, it gives the place an ability to make the past, in this case, Kampong Ayer's past, to come to life in the present through these different names and through the different symbols that exist in the landscape. And thus, these names and the different performances in the landscape can contribute to the production and reproduction of social memory. Next. Thank you. So within the villages in Kampong Ayer, people and places are mainly connected by walkway networks, also known as titian, which serves as an important form of connectivity in Kampong Ayer. Not only are these walkways used for walking, in some of the villages, they use these walkways for non-motorized vehicles, for example, bicycles or rickshaws, which are used to transport goods and even people. So these, in some areas of Kampong Ayer, the height of the walkways have changed over time to parallel or trying to adapt to the situation with the sea level, because in light of climate change, I think one of the problem in Brunei that we will face is, as an effect of climate change, should be a sea level rise. So the government working with the community there, they try to adapt to the sea level there as well by increasing the height of the walkways. Next. And between the different villages, they're connected by bridges called pile. So both titian and pile are unique features of the water village, and the residents use it, and the visitors would use it to travel from one village to another. And the bridge not only act as a connectivity, as a mode of a walkway for people to travel from one point to another, it also acts as a cultural marker for the residents there or for for tourists, a cultural marker that one is about to enter a new kampong. And it also has a local meaning. Some people use it for as a communal spaces where they gather. Next. Okay, so Titian Pail, as I mentioned before, that is also used as a communal space for people to gather during their free time, for children to fly their kites. And to some residents, it serves for socioeconomic purposes, where the titian or jetty becomes a location for people to cast their fishing rods, to cast their nets, and fishing activity is a common sight in Kampong Ayer. Because I remember when I did my research there and I interviewed one of the older people. So there's a local story that every 15th of the Islamic month, there would be a lot of people coming to Kampong Ayer because there's a belief that they would catch a lot of fish. And I think preserving this kind of knowledge would be useful in light of climate change as well, because the climate change committee in Brunei also identified that biodiversity loss would be one of the effect of climate change in Brunei in the future. But mostly these people who are fishing in Kampong Ayer or casting nets, they either catch the fish for their sustenance or as a hobby. Next. So over the years, the landscape changes in Kampong Ayer, especially in the 20th and 21st century, when documents are easily accessible, are mainly resulted from hazards, particularly fire incidents and house collapse. And also development projects, for example, the National Housing Scheme, which eventually changes the spatial layout of Kampong Ayer and the architectural styles of the area. And recently, we have the development of Raja Istri Pangeran and Haja Saleha Bridge, and also Makota Jubilee Emas Park, which has impacted the area as well, where some people are relocated. And I'll show you the map on how these changes have occurred over a couple of years due to the construction. Yeah, and that is a picture of Kampong Ayer in 1950s, and we can see how people are still using bamboo or some sort of wood material and nipah leaves to roof their house. Next slide, thank you. So one of the main hazards in Kampong Ayer is occurrences of fire. So these fires are more human-induced, unlike in those places, for example, in California. I think this is the fire season as well, where fire is more of a natural occurrence, so to speak, because it's like, okay, this time is a fire season, but in Kampong Ayer, it's more human-induced, where from 1981 until 2017, there have been 838 fire incidents. And fire was more prominent actually during the late 20th century, not so much in the 21st century. Although after 2017, there's a few fires, but it's not as large as it was in the 1992, 1993 time. So some of the causes of these fires are due to close proximity of the wooden houses that were built to one another. And this has always been subject to frequent destruction by fire. And some are due to illegal electrical wiring systems, the introduction of liquefied gas utilities, and abandoned houses. So abandoned homes, some of my participants argues that some of the abandoned homes, they didn't properly disconnect their electrical wiring, so that caused a spark. And because of the close proximity of this one house and the condition at that time, sometimes during low tide, it's harder for the first responder to access the area, or the wind would be strong and then it makes the fire spreads easily. So that also cause a problem. And when it comes to low tide and when it comes to the wind, the strength of the wind, that is pretty much beyond our control. So that's another factor that has caused the landscape change in Kampong Ayer. Next. So another form of hazard that have caused the landscape change in Kampong Ayer is biodeterioration due to the materials of the houses. So vegetation would grow on the stilts in particular. And also kapang or termites of the sea starts eroding the wooden the wooden stilts, which caused destruction of infrastructures. And among the people of Kampong Ayer, it's harder to transport their building materials from the land, and it's more expensive. So what they usually do is they would like put fillers using concrete, but not so much really strengthening the infrastructure, so that they can do with what they only do what is available to them at that time, trying to reduce the cost of the transportation. Okay, next. And so for communities who are affected by these fire hazards or house collapse, so the government of His Majesty would provide with various forms of assistance and aids. And for example, the housing at Kampong Bokya A and Kampong Bokya B. So the purpose of this housing scheme was for Kampong Ayer residents at Kampong Pramu, Kampong Setia Pahlawan, and Kampong Sabadarat B in September 1992, which affected 183 households or families, with 1,083 people lost their homes. So as well as for those residents who did not want to move to the mainland, and the residents started to move in the 1994. So the reason why I'm showing this picture is, you can see in circle, you can see how the special layout of Kampong Ayer has changed. Initially, on the old side of Kampong Ayer, it was more organic. It was disoriented because of particular culture practices there. But in the new housing scheme, it's more linear and organized. And I remember in one of my interview with my participants, they mentioned that it was much more fun living in the old Kampong Ayer, because you know your neighbor, and you can get lost in the maze of walkways, but still you'll find your way eventually. But and in the new housing scheme, they felt a loss of sense of community at one point at that time. Yeah. So this new residential area is located not far from the main Kampong Ayer. Yeah, it's not far from Kampong Ayer, and there's still people residing in this area. Next. And another housing scheme that was developed within the vicinity of the main Kampong Ayer that we all know is the 2021 Kampong Ayer upgrading pilot project. So the Kampong Ayer upgrading pilot project was implemented, which occupied an area in 6 kampong in Mukim Pramu, Mukim Sabah, and several areas in Mukim Sungai Kebon. So this project aims at beautifying and conserving the environment of Kampong Ayer with the completion of modern, strong, and well-arranged houses. Next. Next slide. Yeah. So under this project, major changes can be seen in the spatial patterns of Kampong Ayer, which results from the changes in the microspaces, from wooden irregular pattern to concrete and great iron pattern walkways, from a spacious to smaller than usual balconies, and also the presence of storage space under the house, particularly in the new housing area. So the reason why I highlighted the bigger to a spacious to smaller than usual balconies is because among the people in Kampong Ayer, or among Bruneians in general, that like to have their balconies, particularly those who are living in Kampong Ayer, they prefer to have their balconies slightly bigger, because that's where they could host events, and that's where they would hang out with their families and neighbors. So it has a cultural significance, these balconies, and cultural purposes is specific to the people in Kampong Ayer, and also some of the Bruneians as well who are living on land. So, space, scholars have argued that space represents the culture of the people, and that the living space arrangement within the house or between the houses has an important representation and reflection on the Malay culture in Kampong Ayer. So on the picture on the left with the picture of the mosque, so you can see how disoriented, a little disorganized the spatial patterns are, because back in the old days, so what Kampong Ayer people would do is, so let's say they would arrange their house in an organic manner. For example, the communities tend to build their houses closer to or surrounding the house of the head of the family. So for example, the father's house is in the middle. So when the kid get married, so they will build the house just near the father, and it just grows that way in such an organized pattern and in an organic manner. And that is part of the culture as well. And as we can see, as Brunei try to adapt to the sea level rise, and try to reduce occurrences of fire. So they try to have they build a more sustainable, I would say, or higher houses, so that the sea level or the tide wouldn't reach the floor of the houses. Next page, thank you. So another changes in Kampong Ayer is also the architectural style. So in 1950s, you can see on the top part of the slide, 1950s, you can see how the houses were roofed by leaves and walled and floored by bamboos. So in contemporary times, you can see in the middle picture and towards the very right of the screen, the people in the old Kampong Ayer, they had the choice to design their house, which material they want to use. But if you see at the bottom section of the slide, this is the new housing area where the houses are more standardized while retaining some basic elements of a typical Malay house. So with balconies as an important communal space, and as I mentioned earlier, like storage space. At the bottom there, it's basically where the fishermen would store their nets. And I think this is a sort of adaptation that the Brunei government is trying to work with the people in Kampong Ayer. We're trying to reduce the fire hazards. We're trying to not cause your probably the houses not to be affected so much by the high tide, trying to give the residents some sort of security in that part. Next. Next would be the Raja Isteri Pengiran and Haja Saleha Bridge. So this development this bridge is also known as Sungai Kebun Bridge, which connects the city center on the on the left side of the screen and to Sungai Kebun or Kampong Ayer area on the right. So it is named after Queen Saleha, the current Queen Sultan of Brunei, and it was inaugurated in 2017. So yeah, next would be the transition. Yeah, so in 2013, before the beginning of the construction of the bridge, a village was there. It's called Kampung Ujung Klinik. But due to the construction, some of the residents in Kampung Ujung Klinik got relocated. So it further shrinks the area of Kampong Ayer. And as you can see in 2017, those houses in Kampung Ujung Klinik has been demolished, and the residents were given houses on land, and they have moved. It reduces the population in Kampong Ayer as well. And now Kampong Ujung Klinik is just known by its name because there's no one living there anymore. Next. And this is the current image of the bridge. And that's how it looks now. So basically, this bridge has made Kampong Ayer more accessible for Bruneians at large, because prior to the development of this bridge, we need to use water taxi, and some people don't find it comfortable, and it made it harder for people to visit Kampong Ayer. But with the development of the bridge, it does instill or cultivate some sort of a renewed sense of place, especially for younger generation, and letting them to learn about Kampong Ayer even more at their own pace. Next slide. Next is the Makota Jubilee Emas Park, which is formerly known as Eco Corridor Park. It's a riverfront public park located in Bandar Seri Begawan, and it was inaugurated as well in October 2017 in conjunction with the Golden Jubilee of Sultan Hassan al Bolkiah's accession to the throne as the 29th and the current Sultan of Brunei. So the park initially was the result of the conceptualization of the Sungai Kedayan Eco Corridor, a project to revitalize the Kedayan River, which includes flood mitigation, environmental rehabilitation, and development of public space. The Eco Corridor Park is also part of a broader Bandar Seri Begawan Development Master Plan, which aims to revitalize Bandar Seri Begawan, particularly in the downtown area, which further developments of commercial, residential, social, and service infrastructure. So in the picture on the left, you can see that's over from the park, you can see the mosque, which is the heritage site, and on the other side of the park, you can see you'll be overlooking Kampong Ayer. Next. So the park and the Eco Corridor project in general are developed in Kampong Ayer area, specifically in Mukim Sungai Kedayan, the one in the circle, which then constituted the Kampong subdivisions under the Mukim or sub-district of Sungai Kedayan. You can see in 2009, there's a lot of houses there. But in 2017, when the project starts to get going, when they start going with the project, so even the villages and even the residents in Sumbiling Lama were also affected by this. So this development has inevitably caused the relocation of some 500 residents from the area, and the entire Mukim is now ceased to exist. And the project has caused, similar like the one with the bridge, it has caused concern on the vitality and even existence of the Kampong Ayer area or Kampong Ayer as a community, which has already been under threat from the dwindling population due to the continuous emigration to the land over the years. Next. And this is the current image of Kampong Sungai Kedayan area, where you don't see any houses left, and Eco Corridor Bandar Seri Begawan, and that is how it looks like now. Next one. And this is what Kampong Ayer looks like today, and the bridge in particular has become a significant landmark of Kampong Ayer. And you can see how from the previous maps, I hope I was able to show it clearly from the previous map, how the special layout of Kampong Ayer from the bird eye view have changed. And now we only have from hundreds of villages to 60 villages, and now we only have 30 villages in Kampong Ayer. Next. But despite the changes in Kampong Ayer, there's still some residents who are living there, and there's still some people who connects to their environment, where Brunei River is central to the livelihood of the people of Kampong Ayer. The water body has become a source of food and sustenance for the local community living inside and outside of Kampong Ayer. It has also become a source of income among the water taxi driver, who we also known as Perahu Tambang. And even though Kampong Ayer is more accessible today than it was before, with the development of the bridge, you can get to Kampong Ayer just using your car, but water taxis are still the main mode of transportation for school children and teachers who are teaching in Kampong Ayer. So I would argue that water is central in cultivating a sense of place, particularly for people in Kampong Ayer, as well as among its former residents who would come back over the weekend. So some people who receive homes, who has homes on land, those people are interviewed, they would make sure that they will come back to Kampong Ayer during the weekend, because they have a sort of sense of attachment there with their house and with the community there as well. That could be the reason why they want to visit Kampong Ayer every weekend. And also it cultivates a sense of place for Bruneians as well at large. So for the people of Kampong Ayer, the river represents their home, a sense of place that can be felt. So this mode of living reflects the traditional bonds the inhabitants of Kampong has with the water. Excuse me. Next. So scholars argue that water gives a place a distinct setting and identity, and features prominently in the sense of place. So sense of place can be defined and described as subjective and emotional attachment that people have to a place, which can be formed or cultivated through individual and social experiences. For the people of Kampong Ayer, they have lived there all their life, and they have built that sense of place or attachment to Kampong Ayer itself and their interaction with the environment. For example, the visitor who goes to Kampong Ayer just to fish, and probably some of them even know, okay, this is my place and this is where you can find most of the fish. So that kind of knowledge among the fishermen, or among the fishers, are also exist in Kampong Ayer. And sense of place is an important foundation of community resilience. And resilience is the ability to cope and deal with changes that inevitably occur, to be able to adjust to and to recover from a change. So the notion of resilience goes hand in hand with the idea of adaptability, where adaptability can be described as the capacity to adapt existing resources and skills to new situations and operating conditions. So scholars argue that place attachments support adaptation when livelihoods are threatened by changes. And for people of Kampong Ayer, the climate change effect of sea level rise, biodiversity lost, and also the declining population that has been happening in Kampong Ayer over the last few years. So by adapting to these changes, community structure and character of a place can be retained, which may foster social resilience. Next page. But regardless of the changes in the natural environment, so Brunei River has set the stage for people to do whatever they want to do, to revive how it was Kampong Ayer then, or trying to adapt to the culture or the globalization processes and the different technology that they want to adapt to. But Kampong Ayer will still be there. The water itself, where they find a sort of attachment, will still be there. I would also like to share this story. One of my participants, he's older, and he mentions to me that he has a house on land. And I said, why didn't you move to see your kids on land, and it'll be easier for you to move around? He said he doesn't want to leave Kampong Ayer because, let's say if you don't have money and you don't have food, you can just get on your fishing rod and just wait, and eventually you'll be able to catch a fish and that put food on the table. Or if you don't have a boat, let's say, to bring you from point A to point B, he said you can just knock on your neighbor's door and you can always borrow his boat. So he felt a sense of place in that sense, a sense of community as well, because he has lived in Kampong Ayer for as long as he has been alive. So among the people in Kampong Ayer, their forms of adaptation can be seen in their embrace of new technologies and in their participation in Brunei tourism effort as part of Kampong Ayer Walking Trail, where some of the community, they develop home-based eateries in Kampong Stia, providing homestays, for example, Kunyit 7 Lodge, and incorporating elements and characteristics of Kampong Ayer, just so they could share the experiences of how it feels to eat in Kampong Ayer and how it feels to stay in Kampong Ayer, even though it's just temporary. Next page. And among the people of Brunei who are not living in Kampong Ayer, the changing landscape also instills a renewed sense of place, as Kampong Ayer has also led to an increase of domestic tourism, especially during COVID. During COVID, Bruneians can't really go. I mean, everyone around the world can't really travel anywhere. So you can see, from my observation, the younger generations, because of the bridge as well, it's accessible. They were able to visit these different sites within Kampong Ayer, and it does give them a renewed sense of place among the younger generations. And as you can see here, so some of the trails specifically focuses on local crafts, even though that some of the older specialists of these local crafts are no longer there, but by having these displayed, we can revive a sort of tradition and sustain this kind of practice. Next. We also have homestay, and the resident of Kampong Ayer and the government works together to maintain a homestay and Kampong Ayer Cultural Tourism Gallery as a sort of for educational purposes, to educate not only visitors but also the younger generations on how Kampong Ayer was during its golden years and how Kampong Ayer has transitioned until today. Next. Next is also home-based eateries. This is one of the main attractions going to Kampong Ayer. So people would eat outside of their homes in the balconies, and it's not an indoor restaurant. So people appreciate this kind of the ambiance and the environment, and also local kue or desserts, which Kampong Ayer was known for back in the days. Next. Next. Yeah. So I will end this presentation with this creative representation of Kampong Ayer made by one of my former advisors back in Brunei, Dr. Ken Whalen, and a couple of his students. So this montage depicts the strong relationship between the people of Kampong Ayer and their natural as well as their built environment. You can see the kids running on the walkways and how the cats are just hanging out by the pipes. These elements, even though that they might look mundane to some of us, but it has their own meanings among the people of Kampong Ayer. It impacted their lives in one way or another. So in various ways, it shows these different ways of life of the people and the different resources that they have there. So thus cultivating their own sense of place. So in light of climate change, sense of place is important in instilling a sense of resiliency and adaptability among the communities. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, the houses in the new housing scheme are built in a slightly higher elevation than the houses that were built organically by the community. And then before I end my presentation, I'd like to share. So for those people who have visited Kampong Ayer before, maybe this will bring back some memories of how it was to be in that environment. And I'd like to share a preview of the soundscapes of Kampong Ayer. Okay, I hope it did transport some of the people who have visited in Kampong Ayer just now. But if you have a chance to, once COVID is at easy pace, when you travel to Kampong Ayer, hope you'll be able to hear those sounds. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you, terima kasih, and mahalo.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Dalilah Nabilah, for your presentation on Kampung Ayer. I think it captures well, a lot, if not that sense of how a lot of these places that people identify with, how they're changing over time, especially with the pressures of development, the changing environment. No? But there's also that influence that both helps conserve it, but also changes it, like tourism and how tourism is helping both continue these things, but also sort of like also introduces new things into the area. No? Okay, so yeah, so it's a great presentation and a great way to capture what's going on in Kampong Ayer and how it's changing over time. No? And there are a bunch of questions. No? So maybe I'll start with let's say lighter ones, then move to heavier ones as we progress. No? And I think anyway we have time to discuss a number of these. No? Let's start here with a question from Gerlam Bhakti Putra. Such a beautiful spatial experience. Could you recommend readings and online resources where we can start to learn more about Kampong Ayer? Thank you.
Okay. So some of the readings that can be conveniently found about Kampong areas, you can visit Brunei Tourism. So they have put together, they're really trying to preserve or conserve Kampong Ayer. So they have put together some materials on what Kampong Ayer is. And also, I would say some local blogs, for example, Brunei Resources, Blogspot, they've also featured some stories about Kampong Ayer and also some media outlets. Media outlets, for example, Media Permata that I've mentioned in my sources, or Pelita Brunei, that's also another easy or accessible resources to learn more about Kampong Ayer. I hope that helps answer the question.
Okay. Thanks for that. I'm combining two questions. One from an anonymous attendee and from Helen Jarvis. Could you give more detail of sea level changes past and present? And also, could you discuss how sanitation happens in Kampong Ayer?
So for the sea level changes, I don't have the specific data accessible to me, but I remember when I did my interview, the people of Kampong Ayer. So what it was around 2015 when I did my undergrad research for the people in Kampong Ayer. So at that time, their concern was that the development or the shrinking, the reduction of the size of the riverbanks in Brunei. So they were concerned that during high tide, the water would reach their house and then suddenly flood their house. But apparently that hasn't happened yet. But even the closest that they would be, the closest that the water would get among the older side of the older section of Kampong Ayer residential area would be just right underneath, like a few inches underneath their floor. But it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. So that's why the government decided to, the National Housing Scheme, they increased the stilts or the elevation of the houses. And even among the people of Kampong Ayer, so they tried to adapt that, follow the footwork of the national, or the pathway of the National Housing Scheme as well. But when it comes to sanitation, in the National Housing Scheme, I know that they have portable sewage system, and the government also offer incentives and subsidized portable sewage system as well for the community who are living in the older section area of Kampong Ayer. And as for the rubbish or garbage, so the government of Brunei, they provided on land, we have garbage truck. So we have a garbage boat, so to speak. So these people would go to the different houses and collect the different trash bags that they have within the community. So that's how they try to clean the Kampong Ayer now.
I think that's also relates to another question, sanitation. How about sewage? How is it piped? Like, is it piped throughout the whole network and there are sewage treatment plants or something? How does that work?
I think there's a centralized, in Brunei, the sewage treatment is centralized in a particular place. But I know if you go to Kampong Ayer, you'll see all these pipes near the walkway. That's pretty much another kind of like visuality that you would see in Kampong Ayer.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so here's another question from Muhammad Kamdevi. Are there some old Malay traditional houses like those in the pictures that still survive and are conserved until today? Are they a lot, and how have they changed?
Okay. The 1950s. This is an interesting question. So the 1950s houses are no longer there, but if you go to the museum, they have almost a similar depiction of that, but most probably because the leaves are not sustainable or not feasible within the current climate of Kampong Ayer as well. So not so much traditional house, but they do maintain some basic element using wood to build their houses. But yeah, we don't have that 1950s Kampong Ayer house anymore, but we do have people who still design their house in their own way while maintaining some cultural significance of the different spaces, for example, balconies and storage underneath their houses. Yeah.
Okay. Here's something a bit related from Thomas Lyall. How much say do the local residents have in the design of new homes? They are obviously safer and more substantial, but seem to lack traditional character.
The local residents, well, I didn't get to ask this question during my research, so I can't really specifically address this question. They didn't really have, the local resident, they didn't have much to contribute to the design as well, but among the local residents who are residing there, they're pretty happy with what's going on and the current condition of their houses as well. It's more sturdy and they don't really have to worry about because the government did incorporate certain elements, like I mentioned earlier, the balconies was important to them. Big kitchens are important for Bruneians as well. And they have portable switch system that they don't have to worry about installing. But they did adapt or improvise and adapt with their new housing situation.
Okay. Here's something from Razia Ahmad. Okay. While preserving Kampong Ayer with new housing and better facilities and infrastructure is good. Wait, sorry, it moved. Wait, let me move to another question. Okay. Here. Okay. From Brit Kayan, is there any set of criterias as determinants for appreciation upon outstanding universal value inherited by Kampong Ayer? Also, how about adoption, classification of core, buffer zone in the context of control, protection, conservation? Yeah, so essentially, like, is there a conservation strategy being adopted for Kampong Ayer, and what would its outstanding universal value be to underline that conservation strategy?
Okay. So for the outstanding universal value of Kampong Ayer, I mean, one of the main criteria of being listed in UNESCO heritage would be authenticity and some sort of integrity. But in Kampong Ayer, a lot has been these authenticity within the definition of UNESCO. It doesn't really affirms to the UNESCO criteria of authenticity. But if anything, I would say that the natural landscape that is surrounding Kampong Ayer, especially the mangrove forest there that you can find along Brunei River, and the kind of relationship that the Bruneians has with the mangrove forest, I think that could be part of OUV for the heritage side. Another question, conservation strategies of that area. I think at this point, what the government is trying to do is trying to prevent people from moving out of Kampong Ayer, because that has been going on for over the years, and we have seen the changes in Kampong Ayer, and some of the abandoned some of the houses, those residents who have like homes on land, some of them rented out to foreign workers, things like that. So the demographic composition of the area has changed as well. But I think that's one of the main concern now in Kampong Ayer, less about conservation strategies, but more on trying to keep people in Kampong Ayer and preventing them from moving out. Because recently we have a legislative council where the government like talking about, okay, how can we revitalize Kampong Ayer even more and allowing people to stay there. I think that's part of conservation strategies in Kampong Ayer, more like retaining people as part of the culture of Kampong Ayer. Yeah.
Right. So it's really more about trying to keep the community alive, the people there alive, as a community alive, right?
Mhm.
And I think, yeah, so this is a related question. So while preserving Kampung, yeah, so this is Raza's question earlier now, so I was able to find it. While preserving Kampung Ayer with new housing and better facilities and infrastructure is good, do you think it's losing its genius loci and authenticity? How do you view the presence of a homogeneous landscape pertaining to the existing cultural landscape as a whole? And any existing policies in Brunei to protect or preserve the authenticity of Kampung Ayer?
Authenticity.
Yeah.
That's a pretty sensitive issue. But when it comes to authenticity in Kampong Ayer, I think the authenticity relies on the person who visit and who resides in Kampong Ayer. Of course, the residents of Kampong Ayer, they would say, yeah, a lot has changed in Kampong Ayer. So when a lot of changes occurs, authenticity is affected. But among the people who visited Kampong Ayer, the authenticity depends on like how do they define authenticity. It can get authentic as it can get. Some people find the authenticity of Kampong lies in the water as well. As long as we have water, then Brunei River serving Kampong Ayer as an arena for Kampong Ayer, that is authentic. But when it comes to architectural authenticity, as I've shown earlier, that's not much going on. But if we're looking at the intangible aspect of authenticity, there are some practices that I would say that are still authentic in Kampong Ayer, the way people greet one another, the sense of community there that has been going on over the last year, for as long as Kampong Ayer has been there. I think the other question is about homogeneity.
Yeah.
How do I view of the presence of homogeneous landscape pertaining to the existing cultural landscapes as a whole? I would say I think for some reason I like how Kampong Ayer are not really preserving the quaintness of it or try to retain their old landscape, and now what the government has done is try to improvise and adapt to the current situation and how we can make how tourism can benefit Kampong Ayer. For me, I don't see it as a problem as well because it's just part of culture, where culture always changing and authenticity, of course, is always changing, and it's relative within a particular historical cultural context. Yeah. Did I answer all the question for Ms. Radia Ahmad? Yeah.
Here's a question from Karul Baria binti Mustafa. I'll just handle the first part of the question since the second one had been answered already. How about the social class living in Kampung Ayer? I guess it's the social dynamics, right, between poor and rich sections of the community. How does that work in Kampung Ayer?
Okay, the social dynamics there's no segregation, I would say, even though that one of the houses that I show, like huge and 2 stories, that has become one tourism attraction. But among the different people in Kampong Ayer, I would say live in their own sense of community. There is no discrimination between the poor and the rich. Not from my last research, I don't encounter that kind of problem being expressed by the residents in Kampong Ayer. Yeah.
Okay. What's the current population of Kampong Ayer? What percentage of the Malay community still lives in Kampong Ayer?
I don't have the number. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't have the number yet, but I know it's definitely less than 30,000 people for sure. And I think as of now, with the shrinking of the village size to 30 villages, pretty sure that the number of residents there have shrunk greatly from 30,000 to probably 10,000 or even less. Yeah, but I don't have a specific number to that question.
Okay. Let's see. Here's something from Joshua Ong. could you elaborate more on how the government managed to work with the Kampong Ayer residents to get them involved in preserving and promoting the heritage and culture of the area through tourism? Were the residents at first resistant to the introduction of tourism? Are there aspects of tourism that residents do not like?
Okay, so how the government managed to work with the people of Kampong Ayer is Kampong Ayer's residents mainly. So we have the Penghulu and Ketua Kampung as the mediator between the government and the community. So we did it from there. And some community there, they work with the different NGOs, and the NGOs also help government and in expressing their intentions when it comes to Kampong Ayer. And when it comes to tourism reaction, were the residents at first resistant to the introduction of tourism, or the aspect of tourism currently that residents do not like? As of now, the community are really participating in in this tourism efforts. From my interview, I remember I interviewed one tourist during my research, and one of the comments I remember is that how some of the residents of Kampong Ayer, they would say hi to this tourist, and some even invited them to come to their house. Like, okay, please come to my house. So that kind of friendly gesture by the resident among the tourists can be seen until today. As well as what was their first reaction? Usually when it comes to tourism operators, they will usually bring tourists to the outer skirts, the outer side of Kampong Ayer, not so much towards the deep side, because when you start walking on your own towards the deeper side of Kampong Ayer, you'll get lost. But eventually you'll find your way. But as of now, or for as long as I'm concerned, none of the residents that I've interviewed expressed their dislike towards the tourists. Some even embrace the tourists because it gives them opportunity to open businesses and selling their products. So for example, in the new housing scheme, some of the community use their balconies to sell their products, to sell the traditional products, because they know that when the tourist comes, they would be interested in learning about the different crafts work that they displayed in their balconies. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, we're out of questions. We're out of questions. So I guess at this point, first, I'd like to thank Dalilah for her presentation. It was good to see and understand another place from Southeast Asia, and one that is in the heart of the capital of Brunei. But do you have any final words, Dalilah? Like if you have a few thoughts that you'd like us to remember about Kampong Ayer?
It's definitely the place that you should visit when it comes to Brunei, and just open your senses to the different sounds and the different smells and the different, just your senses embrace that. And that's what makes Kampong Ayer special. Even though that you see cats walking on, just right below the walkways, they're still fine. And that's just part of Kampong Ayer landscapes and culture there. Yeah. Do come and visit Kampong Ayer. And if I'm back in Brunei, and I would love to show all of you around.
Okay, great. Okay. We'd like, of course, to thank everyone who joined us today, everyone in the audience. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation. I'd like to invite everyone in the audience to subscribe to Sicha's YouTube channel and to follow us on Facebook, because the next program will be announced via email and our Facebook page. So please stay tuned to all announcements on those platforms. And with that, again, we'd like to thank Dalilah for a great presentation and her talk from me and all of us on the Sicha team. Okay. And thank again, everybody. And we thank everyone for their participation and involvement. See you again in our next chat time.
Thank you.